For 30 years, this murder case was stuck. No new clues, no suspects, nothing. But in 2024, a single piece of forgotten evidence was reopened. One item that had been sitting there for 3 decades, waiting. And when the lab ran a brand new DNA test on it, the results stunned everyone, including the killer who thought he'd gotten away forever. This is the full story of how a 30-year-old cold case cracked open because of one microscopic detail no one noticed. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it was overlooked for 3 decades. That one invisible trace would become the voice that finally demanded justice.
Welcome to True Crime Tapes, where we bring you the most gripping, mysterious, and heart-stopping stories from the world of true crime. If you're fascinated by the unknown and want to uncover the secrets that the world tries to hide, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling story. And for those of you already part of our community, welcome back. We're glad to have you with us. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts and theories, because we love hearing from you. True Crime Tapes. The truth is always stranger than fiction.
April 1994, a small city in the Northwest. The kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names, where violence felt like something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. But on April 23, 1994, that illusion shattered. Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, was found in her apartment, a young woman with her entire life ahead of her, a teacher, a daughter, a friend to so many. She had plans that weekend. She had dreams. She had people who loved her and needed her. And in one brutal, senseless act, all of that was stolen. The investigation began immediately. Detectives investigated the neighborhood. They interviewed friends, co-workers, family members. They collected evidence from the scene: fingerprints, fibers, personal belongings. They followed every lead, chased every tip that came through the hotline. But as weeks turned into months, the case began to cool. The technology of 1994 had limits. DNA testing existed, yes, but it was primitive compared to what we have now. It required large samples, perfect preservation, substantial amounts of biological material. Some evidence from Sarah's case simply couldn't be tested with the tools available at the time. There were no matches in the limited DNA databases that existed back then. No fingerprints that pointed to anyone in the system. Witnesses were unreliable, their memories fuzzy, their accounts contradictory. One by one, the leads dried up. The phone stopped ringing. The case file grew thicker, but no closer to resolution. And then it went cold. Detectives kept one box from the case, a box labeled with Sarah's name and a case number, a box they believed held nothing useful, nothing that could crack the case open. They stored it away, thinking they'd done everything humanly possible. They were wrong. That box held something that would one day speak louder than any witness, more clearly than any confession. But in 1994, no one could hear it yet. Let me take you back to those first frantic weeks after Sarah's death. The anger in that police department was palpable. Officers worked 18-hour days. Detectives skipped meals, lost sleep, pushed themselves to the edge of exhaustion. Because this wasn't just another case to them. This was their community. This was someone's daughter. The lead detective, Marcus Reynolds, was a 20-year veteran. He'd seen his share of tragedy, but this one hit different. Sarah reminded him of his own daughter. Same age, same bright smile in the photos her family provided. He made a promise to Sarah's mother: "I will find who did this. I won't stop until there's justice." It was a promise that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The initial investigation focused on several theories. The first, and most obvious, someone Sarah knew. Statistics tell us that most victims know their attackers. So detectives looked hard at her ex-boyfriend, her co-workers, anyone who'd had recent contact with her. They administered polygraph tests. They verified alibis. They dug into backgrounds and personal histories. Nothing held up. Every single person they suspected had rock-solid alibis, or no motive, or both. The second theory: a stranger attack. Perhaps someone who'd been stalking her, watching her patterns, waiting for an opportunity. Detectives went through her daily routine, where she shopped, where she exercised, where she ate lunch. They reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses. They interviewed store clerks and gas station attendants and anyone who might have noticed someone suspicious. Again, nothing. No mysterious figure lurking in the background. No pattern of harassment or strange encounters. The third theory was the one that filled detectives with the most rage: a random act of violence. The worst kind of crime to solve because there's no connection, no relationship, no obvious motive. Just wrong place, wrong time, wrong person walking through the door. Evidence was collected meticulously. Every fiber, every hair, every fingerprint was logged and preserved. This was before the age of digital photography, so crime scene photos were taken on film. Evidence bags were sealed and dated and initialed. Everything was done by the book. But here's where that one flawed assumption came in. An assumption that would derail the investigation for 3 decades. Detectives found a piece of fabric at the scene. A small torn piece that didn't match anything Sarah owned. It appeared to have blood on it, but the testing available in 1994 could only confirm it was human blood, type O positive. That's one of the most common blood types, shared by roughly 40% of the population. The assumption? That this piece of fabric was too small, too degraded, too contaminated to ever yield useful information. It was logged into evidence, sealed in a bag and filed away. The thought was, we've tested it, we've documented it, we've done what we can with it. Move on to other leads. That piece of fabric would sit untouched for 30 years, because in 1994, detectives didn't know that one day scientists would be able to extract a full DNA profile from a sample the size of a pinhead. They didn't know that touch DNA, the microscopic skin cells we leave on everything we contact, could be recovered and analyzed. They didn't know that what seemed useless in their time would become the key in another. The clue that would one day solve the case was collected, but it wasn't even tested. Not really. Not the way it needed to be. 30 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 30 years of a family wondering, waiting, suffering. 30 years of a killer walking free, living a life he had no right to live. 30 years of injustice. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, Sarah Mitchell's case faded from public memory. The local newspaper stopped running anniversary stories. The TV stations moved on to other tragedies. In a world of constant news cycles and endless information, old cases disappear into the background noise. But for Sarah's family, every single day was a reminder of what they'd lost. Her mother, Patricia, never stopped searching for answers. She called Detective Reynolds monthly, then weekly as the years dragged on. Anything new? Any developments? Please just tell me you haven't forgotten her. We haven't forgotten, Reynolds would tell her, though his voice grew heavier with each call. We'll never forget. But what could he do? The leads were exhausted. The evidence had been tested with the best technology available. The case was cold, and it stayed cold. Detective Reynolds retired in 2009, 15 years after Sarah's death. It was the one case he couldn't close, the one promise he couldn't keep. At his retirement party, when colleagues toasted his decades of service, his countless solved cases, he stood up and said something that made the room fall silent. I'm leaving with one regret. One face I see when I close my eyes at night. Sarah Mitchell deserved better than I could give her. And somewhere out there, someone knows what happened. Someone is living with that knowledge, thinking they got away with it. I pray that one day justice finds them, because I couldn't. There were other detectives who worked the case over the years. When it went cold, it wasn't officially closed. Cold cases never are. But it was moved to inactive status, filed away. Occasionally, a new detective would review it, hoping fresh eyes might spot something others had missed. But cold cases are difficult. Without new evidence or new witnesses or new technology, there's nowhere to go. You're just reading the same reports, looking at the same photos, hitting the same dead ends. The rage that fueled those early days of the investigation cooled into a kind of grim resignation. This was one that got away, one of the ones that would remain unsolved. But in 2018, something shifted. A new lieutenant took over the cold case unit. Her name was Diane Foster, and she had a different philosophy about old cases. She believed that evidence doesn't age the same way investigations do. She believed that what was impossible to test in 1990 or 2004 or even 2014 might be possible now. She started a comprehensive review of the department's oldest unsolved cases, not just reading files, but physically going through evidence, checking what was stored, what condition it was in, what might be worth retesting with modern technology. That detective would later make a discovery that changed everything, and it started with a routine inventory check. In the summer of 2023, Detective Foster pulled Sarah Mitchell's evidence box from storage. It was box number 942847, sealed with yellow tape, covered in a fine layer of dust. The label was faded but still legible. Inside were the items that had been collected from Sarah's apartment 29 years earlier. Photos, fingerprint cards, sealed evidence bags, and there near the bottom was a small bag labeled Fabric Sample, Unknown Origin, tested 5/1/1994, inconclusive. Detective Foster held that bag up to the light. The fabric inside was maybe 2 inches square, torn edges, dark stains. "Has this ever been DNA tested?" she asked the evidence technician. He checked the log. "Says here it was tested for blood type in '94. That's it. The notes say the sample was too small and too degraded for further testing." Detective Foster felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. "In 1994, maybe," she said. "But it's not 1994 anymore." The rage that Detective Foster felt when she read through Sarah Mitchell's file was cold and focused. Here was a young woman, brutally taken from this world, and for 3 decades her killer had walked free. 3 decades of breathing air he didn't deserve to breathe, of living a life he had no right to live. But rage, channeled properly, can be a tool, and Foster was determined to use every tool available. She contacted the state crime lab and spoke to their forensic DNA specialist, Dr. James Chen. She explained the case, the timeline, the evidence. "I need you to tell me if there's anything we can do with this," she said, describing the fabric sample. Dr. Chen was cautiously optimistic. "The technology has advanced exponentially in the last 10 years alone. We can extract DNA from samples that would have been considered impossible before. Touch DNA, degraded samples, mixtures that used to be too complex to separate. Send it over. Let's see what we're working with." The fabric was transported to the lab under strict chain of custody protocols. Every step documented, every handler logged. Because if this led somewhere, and God, Foster hoped it would, she needed it to be airtight in court. When Dr. Chen received the evidence, he took it to the most advanced section of the lab. This wasn't the DNA testing of the 1990s, where you needed a blood stain the size of a quarter. This was cutting-edge forensic science. The process works like this. Modern DNA extraction can recover genetic material from microscopic skin cells. When someone touches fabric, they leave behind traces of themselves. Cells from their hands, their fingertips, sometimes containing enough DNA to build a complete profile. The fabric from Sarah's case was old. It was degraded. The blood stains had dried and aged and been exposed to various environmental conditions over the years in storage. Under 1994 standards, it was worthless. But in 2024, it was a goldmine. Dr. Chen used a process called low copy number DNA analysis. It can amplify tiny amounts of genetic material, we're talking nanograms, invisible to the naked eye, and create a usable profile. He carefully cut a small section of the fabric, placed it in a solution designed to break down the cells and release the DNA. Then he used specialized equipment to amplify and analyze that DNA. The process took weeks. DNA extraction isn't fast. It's meticulous, painstaking work. Each step has to be perfect because you often only get one shot at it. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, Dr. Chen's computer completed its analysis. When the technician placed the sample into the new machine, they didn't expect anything. Cold cases rarely crack open this neatly. The odds of getting a usable profile from 30-year-old evidence are slim. Then the computer flashed a message they had never seen before. Match confidence, 99.7%, profile complete. Dr. Chen stared at the screen. His hands were shaking slightly. In his career, he'd seen plenty of DNA results. But this was different. This was justice reaching back through 3 decades. He picked up the phone and called Detective Foster. "We have a profile with shh," he said. A full profile, male, unknown subject, and it's good enough to run through the database. On the other end of the line, Foster closed her eyes. After all this time, after all these years. "Run it," she said. "Run it immediately. Let me explain why this breakthrough was possible in 2024 when it wasn't possible in 1994. Because understanding the science makes the triumph even sweeter. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the genetic blueprint that makes each of us unique. With the exception of identical twins, no two people share the same DNA profile. This is how they caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. This is how dozens of cold cases have been solved in the last 6 years. And this is how they were about to catch Sarah Mitchell's killer. Because when Dr. Chen ran that DNA profile through CODIS, searching for a direct match, the system came back with no results. The suspect had never been arrested, never been in the criminal database, but the DNA didn't match anyone in the criminal database. Instead, it matched a distant relative, a third cousin, someone who'd uploaded their DNA to a genealogy site, hoping to learn about their ancestry, never imagining they'd help solve a murder. The hunt was on. Detective Foster knew this was the moment everything could change. But genealogy investigations take time, expertise, and extraordinary patience. You can't rush them. One wrong turn, one incorrect assumption, and the entire tree leads nowhere. She brought in a forensic genealogist named Barbara Wright, a woman who'd worked on some of the most famous cold case breaks in recent years. Barbara had a reputation for being relentless, for seeing patterns others missed, for never giving up on a tree no matter how tangled it became. When Barbara reviewed the DNA matches, she found the strongest lead, a third cousin match with a shared DNA percentage that suggested a common great-great-grandparent. "This is workable," Barbara told Foster. "It's not a close match, but it's enough. We can build from this." And so began one of the most painstaking investigations you can imagine. Barbara started constructing a family tree backward through time, using every resource available: birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data from the 1900s, immigration records, church registries, newspaper archives. She worked 16-hour days, her desk covered in printouts and family charts, lines connecting one name to another, generation after generation. The common ancestor turned out to be a couple who'd immigrated to the United States in 1887. They'd had 7 children. Those children had their own children. The family tree branched and split and grew exponentially. By the time Barbara worked her way forward to the present day, she was looking at hundreds of potential descendants, but most could be eliminated immediately. The suspect was male, so all the female branches were ruled out. The crime occurred in the Pacific Northwest in 1994, so anyone living on the East Coast or overseas at that time was ruled out. She also had approximate age parameters. Based on witness statements and physical evidence from the scene, investigators estimated the suspect was between 25 and 45 years old in 1994. Barbara eliminated branches methodically. One by one, the tree grew smaller. The pool of potential suspects narrowed. After 3 weeks of work, she was down to 12 possible individuals. 12 men who fit the age range, who lived in the right area in 1994, who descended from that common ancestor. She presented these 12 names to Detective Foster. "These are your candidates," Barbara said. "One of these men is your killer." Foster looked at the names. 12 men. 12 lives to investigate. One monster hiding among them. The process of elimination continued. Foster and her team dug into these men's histories. Where were they on April 23, 1994? Did they have alibis? Were they known to police? Did they have any connection to Sarah Mitchell? Most were cleared quickly. Solid alibis. Documented evidence they were out of state or out of the country. No possible connection to the crime. But 3 names remained. 3 brothers, actually. Sons of a man who'd lived in the Pacific Northwest his entire life. The oldest brother lived in California now, had moved there in 1992. Eliminated. The youngest brother had been 17 in 1994, living with his parents under close supervision due to some behavioral issues. Unlikely to have had the opportunity. Probably eliminated, but kept on the list just in case. The middle brother. 32 years old in 1994. living alone in an apartment just 12 miles from Sarah Mitchell's place. His name was David Hendricks. The tree pointed to three brothers, but only one lived close to the crime scene. Detective Foster pulled every record she could find on David Hendricks: driver's license, employment history, tax records, property records, and then she found something that made her blood run cold. David Hendricks had been interviewed in the original investigation. He'd been one of dozens of people questioned in the neighborhood canvass. He lived nearby. He was in the area. Detectives had knocked on his door, asked if he'd seen anything unusual that day, taken his statement. He'd said no, he hadn't seen anything. He'd been at work. He'd seemed cooperative, unremarkable. Just another neighbor they checked off the list. But they'd never looked at him closely. They'd never had reason to. His name had appeared in the file as interviewed, no relevant information, and that was it. For 30 years, he'd been right there in the file. A witness, a neighbor, a killer. The rage that Detective Foster felt in that moment was almost overwhelming. This man had been questioned. They'd been that close. If the technology had existed back then, if they'd had DNA testing that could work with touch evidence, if they'd had forensic genealogy, but there's no use dwelling on what ifs. What matters is now. What matters is justice, even if it arrives 30 years late. Foster knew she couldn't arrest David Hendricks based on genetic genealogy alone. She needed a direct DNA match. She needed his DNA, specifically, to compare to the DNA from the fabric, which meant surveillance, which meant waiting for him to discard something that would contain his DNA, something they could legally collect without a warrant. The hunt moved into its final, most delicate phase. David Hendricks, now 62 years old, lived in a suburban neighborhood about 40 miles from where he'd lived in 1994. He'd married in 2001, divorced in 2009. He worked as a warehouse manager. He had a grown son who lived across the state. On paper, on the surface, he looked like a completely ordinary man living a completely ordinary life. But Detective Foster knew better. This was a man who'd taken a life, who'd stolen someone's daughter, someone's friend, who'd left a family devastated. And then he just continued living, went to work, paid his taxes, probably slept fine at night. The thought made her sick, but she couldn't let emotion drive her actions. This had to be done legally, carefully, completely by the book. Because after 30 years, she wasn't going to let this case fall apart on a technicality. The surveillance team set up, 2 detectives in an unmarked car watching Hendricks's house, following him to work, to the grocery store, to wherever he went. They weren't trying to confront him or spook him. They were waiting for opportunity. In legal terms, once someone throws something away, they've abandoned their expectation of privacy. A discarded coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin. These items can be collected without a warrant because they're considered trash. It sounds simple, but in practice, it requires patience. You can't just grab something from his personal property. It has to be in a public space, clearly discarded. The team followed Hendricks for 5 days, watched him drive to work each morning, same routine, stop at the same coffee shop, park in the same spot, head into the warehouse where he worked. On day 3, he stopped at a fast food restaurant, went through the drive-thru, ate in his car in the parking lot. When he finished, he got out and threw his trash in a public garbage can. The surveillance team waited until he drove away. Then they approached the garbage can, gloved hands, evidence bags ready. Inside was a soda cup with a straw, a wrapper, a napkin. All of it went into evidence bags. All of it was rushed to the lab. Dr. Chen received the items and immediately got to work. He swabbed the straw, the rim of the cup, anywhere Hendricks's lips or hands had touched. DNA extraction was performed, profile generated, and then came the comparison. The DNA from the discarded items was compared against the DNA profile from the fabric found at Sarah Mitchell's scene 30 years ago. Matching 13 standard genetic markers, then 20, then all 25 markers used in modern DNA profiling. Perfect match, absolute certainty. When detectives tested the DNA from the discarded item, the lab called back immediately. "It's him," Dr. Chen said. "David Hendricks, no question. The DNA from your 1994 evidence is a complete match to the sample you just provided." Detective Foster felt something she hadn't felt in years of working cold cases. Not just satisfaction, not just relief, but a kind of fierce, burning vindication. After 30 years, Sarah Mitchell was going to get justice. The arrest warrant was prepared. A judge signed off immediately. Probable cause was overwhelming. DNA evidence linking Hendricks to the crime scene, genealogical investigation, direct DNA match. On a Thursday morning just after dawn, Detective Foster and her team arrived at David Hendricks' house. He answered the door in pajamas, coffee in hand, looking confused. "David Hendricks?" Foster said, badge held up. "Yes? You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell." The color drained from his face. His hands started shaking, coffee sloshing in the cup. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen. I don't know what you're talking about. We have your DNA from the crime scene. We have a match. You're going to need to come with us." As they put him in handcuffs, as they read him his rights, Foster watched his face. She wanted to see remorse. She wanted to see guilt. Some acknowledgement of what he'd done. But all she saw was panic. The panic of a man who'd convinced himself he'd gotten away with it, who'd lived 30 years believing he was safe. That belief had just shattered. But even after the match, there was one more secret the case had been hiding. During the interrogation, David Hendricks refused to talk. He lawyered up immediately, said nothing beyond, "I want an attorney." That was his right, and Foster expected it. But with DNA evidence this strong, a confession wasn't necessary. They had him. The science was undeniable. Still, Foster wanted to understand. She went back through the original case file, now looking at everything through the lens of knowing who the killer was. And that's when she found it. The detail that made her want to scream. In the original investigation, Detective Reynolds had interviewed David Hendricks on April 27, 1994, 4 days after Sarah's death. The interview notes were brief, just a few lines. Subject states he was home alone the evening of 4/23/94. Works night shift at lumberyard, was off that night. Did not see or hear anything unusual. Subject was cooperative. No signs of deception. There was a note in the margin, handwritten by Reynolds. Seemed nervous but willing to help. Verify employment. The employment had been verified. Hendricks did work at a lumberyard. He had been scheduled off that night. But here's what made Foster's blood boil. There was a second note, added a week later. Neighbor reports seeing subject's vehicle parked outside his apartment complex around 11 p.m. on 4/23, consistent with his statement of being home. Case closed on Hendricks. He'd been eliminated as a suspect, but Foster dug deeper. She tracked down the neighbor who'd provided that alibi, an elderly woman who'd passed away in 2012, but her daughter still lived in the area. Foster interviewed the daughter, asking about her mother's statement from 1994. "My mother felt terrible about that for years," the daughter said. "She told me before she died that she'd made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" The detective asked her if she'd seen David Hendricks' car that night, and she said yes. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what night it was. Could have been the 22nd, could have been the 24th. She had early dementia starting back then, though no one knew it at the time. Her memory for dates wasn't reliable, but she wanted to help, so she said yes when the detective asked. She felt awful that she might have, given him an alibi he didn't deserve. It turns out, the truth was always there, buried under a single wrong assumption. The assumption that the neighbor's memory was reliable, that when she said she saw Hendricks's car on the night of the 23rd, it was accurate, but it wasn't. And that tiny error, that small mistake from a well-meaning elderly woman whose mind was starting to fail her, had allowed a killer to walk free for 3 decades. If Detective Reynolds had pushed harder on that alibi, if he'd questioned the certainty, if he'd asked follow-up questions, maybe they would have looked at Hendricks more closely. Maybe they would have found something else, some other piece of evidence that pointed to him. But they didn't. They took the alibi at face value and moved on. And David Hendricks slipped through their fingers. Foster also discovered something else, something that made the case even more chilling. When they searched Hendricks' current residence after his arrest, they found a box in his attic. Inside the box were newspaper clippings, articles about Sarah Mitchell's death, articles about the investigation, anniversary stories from the years when the papers still ran them. He'd kept them. For 30 years, he'd kept a record of the crime he'd committed, the investigation he'd evaded, like trophies, like reminders of what he'd gotten away with. There were also items that had belonged to Sarah, small things that had never been reported missing because they were so insignificant. A pen, a hair tie, a keychain. He'd kept souvenirs. The rage Foster felt when she saw those items is impossible to articulate. This wasn't just a man who'd committed a terrible crime and tried to move on. This was a man who'd held on to it, who'd revisited it, who'd taken some sick satisfaction from having gotten away with it, but he hadn't gotten away with it. Not really. Justice had been slow, agonizingly slow, but it had arrived. David Hendricks went to trial in September 2024. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match, the genealogical investigation, the items found in his home, his presence in the original case file as someone who'd been interviewed and cleared on a faulty alibi. His defense attorney tried to argue contamination of evidence, degradation of the sample, unreliability of decades-old material. But the science was solid. Dr. Chen testified for hours about the protocols, the testing, the certainty of the match. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty, murder in the first degree. Sarah Mitchell's mother, Patricia, now 78 years old, was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She wept. 30 years. 30 years of waiting, hoping, praying for this moment. In her victim impact statement, she said something that haunts me still. For 30 years, I wondered if anyone cared, if anyone remembered Sarah, if justice would ever come. I almost gave up hope. But today I know my daughter wasn't forgotten. Today I know that even after all this time, the truth still matters. Detective Marcus Reynolds, now retired and in poor health, watched the trial from his home via live stream. When the verdict came down, his daughter called Detective Foster to tell her that he'd cried, that he'd said, "Thank you for keeping the promise I couldn't keep." In the end, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a confession or a last-minute witness or a dramatic courtroom revelation. Justice arrived because science evolved. A microscopic clue that once meant nothing, that was logged and filed and forgotten, dismissed as too small, too degraded, too worthless, became the voice that finally spoke for the victim. DNA doesn't forget. DNA doesn't lie. And DNA, given enough time and the right technology, will always tell the truth. Sarah Mitchell waited 30 years for justice, but it came, and David Hendricks will spend the rest of his life in prison where he belongs because of one tiny piece of fabric that held the truth all along. That's the power of forensic science. That's the power of investigators who refuse to give up. That's the power of evidence that waits, silently, patiently, for the moment when science catches up and the truth can finally be heard. Sarah Mitchell's voice was silenced in 1994. But in 2024, through the language of DNA, through the dedication of detectives who never stopped caring, through the advancement of technology that turned the impossible into the inevitable, her voice rang out loud and clear, and justice at long last was served.